Hello, I am Gabriel Broner, and this is the Big Compute Podcast. Today's topic is HPC and AI. We have traditionally used compute power for simulation in HPC. Increasing compute power over the years has enabled users to perform more simulations, more complex simulations, and achieve higher resolution results. Compute power has also enabled AI to advance. We now wonder, is it time to rethink HPC with AI? Where do we see the fields coming together? What benefits do we expect AI will bring to HPC? To discuss HPC and AI, our guest today is Dave Turek. Dave is Vice President for HPC and Cognitive Systems at IBM. Welcome, Dave, to the Big Compute Podcast.
Thanks, Gabriel. Nice to talk to you.
Great. It's good to have you here. And let's start, Dave, by first setting the stage. Why do you think we're seeing growth of AI now, and where is it taking us?
Well, I think when we look at stimulus to growth in markets, typically it's accompanied by either innovation that makes something accessible that previously wasn't, or it's a pricing dynamic where classic tools are now cheaper and more accessible, and by virtue of that, it stimulates dispersion of the tools throughout the market and more people use them. In the case of AI, I think it's really innovation that's driving the uptake in the technology, courtesy of the popularization of the frameworks for sure, and that in concert with different kinds of computing architectures that make it pretty accessible and pretty efficient computationally.
So from your point of view, it isn't simply that the algorithms were always there, but now we have the compute power that we can use them. There's also some innovation that happened in AI to take us where we are today.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the presence of modern computing, which, as you well know, has increased dramatically over the last handful of years, especially with the introduction of accelerators, has been a material feature of the landscape to really drive the acceptance and the utilization of AI.
Yeah. We've seen like GPUs doing pretty well with AI. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, GPUs now, and I think what you're beginning to witness is the commencement, actually been ongoing for some time now, of sort of an arms race of exploration of other kinds of technologies. Not that GPUs will be displaced, but if you divide AI crudely in terms of deep learning and machine learning as categories, subcategories of AI, this whole notion of inferencing has apparently stimulated a lot of venture capital money and a lot of investment and a lot of thinking about alternative architectural forms to GPUs for at least that part of the problem. And I think you'll start to see silicon manifest itself in the market this year for sure, and much more beginning next year as well. So it's not gone unrecognized by clever people around the world, and there's a plethora of things that are going to be forthcoming.
So are you seeing growth mostly on the subset of AI that is machine learning or deep learning more specifically right now?
Well, I think so, but if we were to put this on a time scale, with t equals 0 being the origin, we're at t equals 0.001. I think we're at a very, very embryonic stage. And I think that there are categories of people who are trained or who have trained themselves in terms of using their frameworks, who are doing a lot of experimental work now and a lot of assessment about domains where the technology can be deployed. That's different than operational implementation, which of course would lag this by a little bit of time. And I think a lot of what people are recognizing at growth today is still kick the tires experimentation, assess where the technology is best applied, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just the cusp of what will be a real burgeoning deployment of technologies in an operational sense very shortly.
Yeah. So will this be like with any other technology adoption? First, there's a lot of excitement, then a bit of disappointment, and then big growth. Where do we think we are with AI in that curve?
So I think there's a lot of excitement And I think that there's going to be, rather than characterize it as disappointment, I would say there'd be a fair amount of recalibration. And recalibration meaning a discovery of the domains where it's best used in concert with humans, and domains where it's not. I mean, I think today a lot of the lay community looks at AI in the context of automated driving as maybe the principal example accessible to a lot of people. And that, of course, brings in a whole series of ethical issues, as I think is well known. There are other domains of applicability. For example, in manufacturing domains, you know, can you tell a failed part from a good part, which is sort of devoid of a lot of that ethical consideration that embodies commercial use of technologies like automated driving, which I think is less of a barrier for acceptance and will probably see a lot of deployment, a lot of growth at a much more accelerated pace than these more complicated kinds of areas. And of course, there are variations around all these different kinds of domains. I don't mean to suggest it's a dichotomy, but I think that there are these obstacles that range from the more categorical in the sense of actually putting things into categories that don't have any sort of ethical apparatus surrounding that choice, versus things at the other end typically involve, when you're involved with human interaction, that brings a lot of ethical consideration into play. And that's going to be a little tougher road to hoe.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I lived in Mountain View for 8 years, and I saw self-driving cars in front of me getting confused by a plastic bag floating in the air, right? So I've seen it firsthand that why should we be worried? Well, I don't know, until we feel really comfortable. It's hard to live that way. But I understand there's other domains where we're going to see more growth because it's not an ethical choice, as you mentioned. Listen, Dave, you spent a life in HPC and now several years looking at AI, and I'm very interested in chatting with you about how these two things are coming together. And I actually read an article you had a couple months ago where we talk about how AI can impact HPC workloads. And you talk about two areas, intelligent simulation and cognitive discovery. I wonder if we can talk about the first one first and tell us what is intelligent simulation and how does it impact HPC? Right.
So as its name kind of implies, intelligent simulation is the incorporation of AI methodologies to make standard simulations better in some sense. And you could look at it as, first of all, AI being utilized to define better simulations, AI to operate simulations more efficiently, and certainly AI to interpret the output of simulations more effectively. So it quite explicitly recognizes the utility of simulations and the fact that people work in those domains, and it says, well, how can I make that better for you? Can I help you design better simulations? Can I help them run more efficiently? Can I help you better interpret the results coming out of them? So broadly struck, that's kind of the characterization of what I mean by intelligent simulation. It's the explicit application of AI methodologies to simulation strategies as they exist today, with the intent of trying to make them better in some sense.
So what you mean is, instead of having a person looking at the results of simulations, you really have AI figuring out the results or figuring out how a simulation is going. Should we kill this one? Should we start a different one? Is that what you mean by intelligent simulation?
Yeah. So for example, just think about the problem of executing simulations, which is, crudely put, kind of a digital representation of how we do scientific experimentation in a wet lab kind of sense, where you have a hypothesis, you run an experiment in the lab, you get outputs, you evaluate those outputs, you, the actor being a human, to decide what the variation on that experiment should be to further pursue that hypothesis. In a world of ensembles of simulations, you have sort of the same problem, except rendered in digital form, where you execute a simulation, you get some outputs, you assess how that compares against some objective, shall we say, And then you recalibrate the simulation to run again with some refinements based on your experience, know-how, et cetera, et cetera. And you do that in an attempt to try to produce a result in a very parsimonious fashion. You know, the minimal set of simulations required to get you the insight or understanding that you're looking for. Well, that human agency involved in that process is something that can be augmented by the incorporation of AI, where one can use AI to really assess the outputs of a particular simulation and then make judgments about what the next simulation in that ensemble should be. And by virtue of learning, by participating in this exercise of simulations, the AI system can become a rather effective director of how that kind of work takes place. And certainly, we can imagine how the explicit incorporation of AI inside of a simulation can also be beneficial. You know, this sort of holy grail that you and I have talked about for more than 20 years of real-time application steering, or real-time simulation steering, I should say, is something that's part of that same domain. So all these variations on that theme are part of what I mean by intelligent simulation.
That's great. And it sounds like this is work humans are doing today, right? So this is like the worry of AI. Will this replace the person that today is running the simulations when we have AI get to this level?
Yeah, and here it's an augmentation quite explicitly. It says the simulation still has to be created, human endeavor, and a hypothesis has to be generated, a human endeavor. And now the execution, the design, et cetera, can be aided and abetted by the incorporation of AI. And certainly we've done a lot of work in that area, and I'm sure others are pursuing that as well. So it's an acceptance of the world the way we've done it historically, but the application of a new family of tools, artificial intelligence, to make that set of activities run better than we could do just by ourselves.
That sounds great. Are you seeing any promising results right now?
Yeah, we've actually been working in this area for about 3.5 years, and we've done this in combination with a variety of customers, a variety of disciplines, and we've seen rather stunning results actually in terms of this pursuit of the parsimonious ensemble of simulations. So, and what I mean by that is, you know, we have clients that may do millions of simulations a day, or they may do tens of thousands a day. There are all sorts of ranges of the quantity of simulations. And in a simple sort of HPC sense, if somebody says, well, you have to do 15 million simulations today, you can kind of characterize the simulation, and you can predict the kind of infrastructure you need and cost it and build it and do all those things. But with the incorporation of AI, what we've seen is examples where we've been able to cut down the number of simulations by more than 2/3 on a pretty regular basis. And the benefits of that are quite astounding, right? And depending on your point of view, you either get to reduce the infrastructure you need by a lot, so you save a whole bunch of money, or you take the infrastructure you have and suddenly you're capable of using it for a lot more than you were previously. That is, you've created for yourself excess capacity. So these are pretty stunning results that we've seen. They're replicatable. They're not, at this point, generalizable. And the difference, of course, is I can demonstrate with a particular category of problems similar kind of output, but we haven't generalized it across a hugely vast domain of problem types. We've gotten results as good as a 95% reduction. But I would never advocate that that's the metric that one should look at and say that's what my expectation should be. But I do think that generally speaking, we're going to see a dramatic impact on the efficacy of computing infrastructure by the incorporation of these techniques for that kind of problem domain.
Yeah, so you're saying that you shouldn't expect 95% reduction, but you may expect 2/3, and that's pretty significant. So if I were going to run 100 simulations, maybe thanks to AI, I'm only going to run 33 simulations and get the job done, which means I can buy a smaller system or I can use my system to do more.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
that's significant value and return of investment for the company that is doing this. I wonder if you have any specific examples you'd like to mention, where just one example where we've seen this type of results.
Well, yeah, we've in the pharmaceutical domain, we've used this approach to look at potential drug compounds for efficacy against a particular kind of disease vector, and we reduced a set of about 20,000 compounds for evaluation to about, well, that was a 5% example. So that would be, what, 1,000 compounds for evaluation. So that saved a huge amount of time in that particular case. There's another example which we used, which was in the domain of chemical formulation, where we used an approach based on Bayesian methods to efficiently execute ensembles of simulations to look at combinations of compounds coming together to create a particular molecular output, let's say. And in that particular case, we reduced the amount of computing by more than 60%. I think that was close to 2/3. And we also got a dramatic impact in fidelity of the answer as well as a result. So that was a huge effort. And these approaches are being implemented operationally now by the clients that we've been working with.
It's good to see that you have real examples where you're getting traction that makes it real, right? So maybe what are your thoughts? What do you think you see this style of intelligence simulation in 5 to 10 years, for example?
I think it's going to be a really significant element of the analyst toolkit. And I choose the word analyst carefully because I think one of the things that I'm concerned about, of course, is the use of language and how it impacts behavior and how people think about strategy. So, for example, in our conversation today, we're talking about HPC and AI as if they're two completely separate things. I would argue that they're part of the same family tree, mathematically, algorithmically, computationally, et cetera. There's a relationship there for sure when you begin to look at some of the mathematics underlying the way people are defining neural nets and so on. So rather than encourage this dichotomous view of what's going on, I continually try to talk about the amalgamation of these two fields. And the reason for that is when linguistically we talk about these things separately, then you see people talking about, well, I have an HPC system over here and an AI system over there, or I have an HPC organization here and I have an AI organization there. And that's all nonsense. All that stuff should just be brought together under one umbrella. And we need a sort of different kind of way to describe that. So when I say analyst, I'm talking about the data scientists writ large. So I don't want to be I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to be so precise in terms of definitions here, because if I look at the work of a data scientist and they're doing logistic regression and they're doing deep learning and they're doing machine learning and they're running simulations or they're trying to solve Markov models, why should I try to put that into any sort of convenient taxonomy? Those are just a family of tools that they need to bring together to solve the problem. I think part of the issue here has been we've lost sight somehow of the difference between algorithms and workflows. So one can sort of excise an algorithm and say, well, it's an HPC problem. Let's solve it in an HPC way. Let's build a simulation to analyze it and so on. I think in a commercial deployment, we have to think more appropriately in terms of a workflow, which brings with it potentially a diversity of algorithms, but also a lot to do with data, wrangling data, and getting it prepared and prepped for the different steps. Because it's important from a commercial perspective to really attack the workflow and not elemental parts of the workflow. If you focus on the latter as opposed to the former, you run the risk of progressively working more and more on the margin. And if you don't mind, I'll give you a very concrete example to that. So some years ago, I was working with a company in the oil industry. And as many of your listeners will know, for decades now, people in the oil industry, exploration, have used supercomputing and HPC to great effect. And for 25 years or 30 years, if you had a meeting, someone like myself had a meeting with somebody in an oil company, it all came down to, how do I make reverse time migration run faster? Or how do I make elastic waveform inversion run faster? Or Kirchhoff methods run faster? It was a very algorithmic centric kind of discussion, and very appropriate in that regard. Started to change a few years ago as a lot of the vertical companies began to see the impact of big data on their exploration activities. And the point was struck home to me when I met with this one particular company. We had a day-long discussion of algorithms and architectures on algorithms. And at the end of the day, I posed a question, which I should have posed at the beginning of the day, which was, what's the most important computing problem I can help you with? And they said, sort my data faster. They had a workflow perspective of the problem, and we had rendered that into an algorithmic perspective to our great peril. And I did some back of the envelope calculations, and I found that, if I built a machine that could actually solve their simulation in 0 time, I would have taken maybe 5 to 8% off the total amount of time of their workflow. This happened to be a seismic processing problem. If I could have increased the sort time of data by a factor of 10, which is feasible, I would have cut the workflow down by 40 to 50%. So from the CEO perspective, what should his people be working on? If time is money and a shorter amount of time spent in investigation is better than longer, they should be spending all their time on trying to figure out how to sort data faster, not worried about how to make Kirchhoff methods run faster. So that's why I think that we've gotten ourselves into a bit of trouble over time, is we've continued to focus on algorithms without a consideration of the overall workflow. And once you begin to really embrace the notion of workflow, you begin to see many, many additional domains where AI could play a role to help you optimize that workflow.
It's very interesting to hear your reasoning, because your point, if I can paraphrase, is because traditionally we focus on algorithms for HPC or AI, we may be a bit down in the weeds trying to solve a problem that only improves the overall workflow by a small percentage. Once we look at the real problem we're trying to solve, which may be improve oil exploration, and we look at the complete workflow, we have opportunities with HPC and AI together to solve a much larger problem and optimize the overall workflow much better. In that case, we're talking about not HPC and AI as separate, but HPC and AI together, almost creating a new field. And maybe that's what you call intelligent simulation. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I'll give you an example from the AI domain as well on this regard. And this is very particular to IBM's point of view and our engagement with customers, but I think it's generalizable to just about anybody working in the field. If you have conversations with clients, a commercial client, about the deployment of deep learning and machine learning, the work typically associated with data scientists working in this area, it's very exciting, it's very compelling, it's very sexy. But the simple fact of the matter is that if you look at that in the context of a workflow, you'll find out that that set of activities comprises maybe 15 to 20% of all the activities and all the compute power required for the whole workflow. In fact, the vast bulk and majority of the time, effort, expense, and so on, which comprises about 80 to 85% of the workflow, is all around data. How do I get it? How do I prepare it? How do I organize it? How do I serve it? All those things are the material major part of the workflow associated with what the work data scientists do, and by implication, what people working in AI as data scientists do as well. And the cautionary tale here is, let's not confine ourselves in such a way that the benefits of what we do, as amazing as it might be, find itself progressively more and more on the margin.
Yeah. Now that's a very interesting perspective. You're ahead of many people that come from HPC in thinking about the problem together. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how should people prepare for this change? How will our jobs change going from HPC to, let's call it, intelligent simulation for now?
Well, I think it's just a matter of embracing a new set of tools, right? And in the case of HPC, people have developed new tools and so on over the course of time. And I think that, for example, the development of MPI back 25 years ago was an important tool to really begin to facilitate the use of parallel programming. Now you have OpenACC, you have CUDA, you have other things that facilitate the incorporation of accelerators. And this has been part and parcel of what the HPC family has been about. Develop new tools to solve new problems, study them, learn them, deploy them. I don't think it's any different here. I don't think it's a grand mystery. I don't think it's tremendously difficult. The frameworks are there, which have really gone a long way to facilitate the utilization of these kinds of ideas. And I think it's something. I mean, if I were in charge of a university department, and no one would ever want that, believe me, I think it'll be a natural thing for its inclusion in the pedagogical roadmap of people pursuing computer science, HPC, and so on. I think it'll become very natural for people to look at this. I think the other thing that'll happen that'll stimulate this is, as people discover that AI can not only augment the way they've done HPC historically, but in some cases actually displace it. That is, intelligent simulation, the way we've talked about it, is a strategy of augmentation. It's not a strategy of displacement. The other thing I wrote in that paper about cognitive discovery actually pursues that other angle, which is in response to the fact that some simulations are very expensive to design, build, and run. And B, they just take too long to execute to produce useful kinds of results. Well, if you're faced with that reality, which is nothing more than an articulation of constraints, let's change the game. Is there a different set of tools that gets us out of the box that we're in that particular domain? And that's why we started going down this path of cognitive discovery.
Can you, even though I read the paper, can you share for the listeners, what is cognitive discovery?
Right, and so as I began, this is a notion that says, all right, let's forget the idea of simulation for a second, and let's use AI techniques to solve HPC class problems. So we're not going to do simulation, we're not going to do partial differential equations, we're not going to do any of that stuff that's associated with HPC. We're going to try to take a much more data-centric approach to solving HPC problems. So, I had a drug problem and a chemical formulation problem in the examples I showcased just a couple of minutes ago. Well, but that was still predicated on simulation. And now the question is, well, could I solve those same problems without doing any simulation? Are there a different set of tools that could allow that to take place? And when we asked ourselves that question, the beauty of it was it took us deeply into this issue of the 80% that I outlined a moment ago in terms of the workflow for how people do AI, which is all about this issue of data. So how do you get data? How do you organize it? What's the architecture of the data, and all those kinds of things? And so we began looking at that and said, we need to figure out a way to do that. Okay, got that. But then another thought intruded on us at the same time. If you go back to the 80-20 model that I outlined, I think people are generally comfortable with the idea that you need a data scientist to build these neural nets and so on for AI. What a lot of people may not understand is that you need a lot of other complementary skills that are working on that 80% part of the problem. Data architects and maybe mathematicians and computer scientists, et cetera. And here's the problem. Today, sitting at t equals 0.001 in the time scale of the evolution of AI, those kinds of skills are concentrated in urban areas around the world. So if I'm a company that sits in the middle of the United States, as an example, and I don't happen to be located in a major city, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, Austin, et cetera, the opportunity to get that portfolio of human skills to execute my AI problem is quite problematic. And so, we kicked off the conversation talking about growth of AI. One of the impediments to growth is where the skills required to execute AI are in fact concentrated, right? Yep. So it's hard if you're in Peru, if you're in Ecuador, if you're in Colombia, if you're in the middle of the United States, the middle of Canada, it's a problem, right? If you're in Montreal, if you're in New York, it's not a problem. If you're in London, it's not a problem. So that thought then prompted another idea, which was, okay, how do you deal with the shortage of skills? Well, one of the ways to deal with it is automation. So let's ratchet back to this issue of cognitive discovery. Okay, it's all about the data, but how much of this activity can we begin to automate to actually make the accessibility of AI more, egalitarian, if you will, right? So we took the two ideas and merged them together, and we created automated tools to ingest scientific information at scale. So we have tools that are recognized mathematical equations and graphs and tables and numbers and chemical formula and all that kind of stuff. Automatically architect that information for the delivery to a set of tools that will automatically generate neural nets. So what have we done? We've taken all those skills that are in short supply and we've replaced them with automated capabilities, not completely automated. There's still some oversight, hand-holding, and in some cases, some very detailed work that needs to be done. But in the majority, most of it's removed. And it turns out that the tools actually do a quite extraordinarily good job of going all the way from the ingestion of data to the creation of information, to the creation of knowledge graphs, to the creation of the opportunity to do semantic search, to the creation of neural nets based on the data that you want to operate on, such that you can't tell the difference between the models that are generated automatically, versus those that are generated by a professional data scientist. And from my perspective, that's one of the big steps that has to be taken by the industry to promulgate the whole notion of how AI begins to get deployed. So this is a really fascinating area because now what we're doing experimentally, again, and we've done this with many, many customers, is we're using these tools to create, one, access to public information that goes quite beyond the scope or capability of normal humans to be able to analyze. So for example, how many digital scientific libraries are there in the world? And the answer is, I don't know, but it's a big number, right? So you look at archive.org out of Cornell, 1.5 or 2 million scientific papers, and you look at WebMD, and you look at Elsevier, and you can just keep going down the list. Some of them are public, some of them are private, but there's a huge amount of information out there. It turns out, as an example, that in 2018, I think there were 450,000 scientific papers in refereed journals just on material science alone. So we have another issue here, right? There's this expansion of knowledge that's getting generated, which would be very useful for people to understand, but it's too much. So, all right, we're going to create systems to automatically capture that information, organize it, and let you operate on it from an AI perspective to create models that are appropriate for the problems that you're trying to solve. So all these ideas have to come together. It's not one by itself. It's not, I have a tool that does this. No, it's a string of tools that get you from the beginning to the end of the workflow that does automation to make the approach egalitarian and that accommodates the kind of notation that's representative of what scientists and engineers do. So all those things are part of the ambition here of what we're trying to do.
So when you talk about a lot of data, you're really talking about results from experiments, but you also talk about papers that have been published all over the world that you're able to ingest, turn into knowledge, turn into inference. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there's another category of data as well, and that's the data that constitutes the corporate memory and know-how of a particular corporation. So I can't get too particular here, but we have customers working in the material science field who have come up against failures in the materials they produced, which carries with it a pretty big financial risk. And they've been in business for a long time, and they have a huge amount of know-how and experience that exists in filing cabinets, in spreadsheets, on hard drives, in corporate database. It's all over the place. There's no organization to it. There's no architecture to it. And there's no ability to operate on it. Even if you took all this documentation and put it in front of the engineers working on the problem they're currently working on, they wouldn't know how to get through it in any kind of reasonable or coherent time. They wouldn't know what they knew. They wouldn't know what they missed. They wouldn't know anything. So it's not simply a matter of external information, knowledge of the field, as critically important as that is. It's a matter of how you capture the know-how within the firm. And I think this is a really critical idea, because if you look at what it takes to acquire know-how, it takes time and training and experience and all that kind of stuff. But people leave, they retire, they get new jobs, they die. All these things take that know-how with them. And I think one of the roles that we're looking at for AI here is to really be able to begin to create these corporate memories, for lack of a better phrase, of their scientific and engineering data, maybe for decades. Now that involves some additional innovation. You've got to be able to handle handwritten notes. You've got to be able to understand and interpret that kind of information. And we're doing work in that area as well. So it's not something that can't be done. We're well along the way to solve that problem. So it's this combination of in-house information and know-how with what's going on in the field that you want to have access to. And getting back to this thread of egalitarianism, the question becomes, how does a 100-person company compete against a 10,000-person company? And I think one of the great levelings that's taking place here is the application and utilization of AI by these small companies that let them behave as if they're big companies. So if I tell you, I've got 450,000 papers just from last year I need reviewed, well, you're not going to look at them all. You've got, maybe if you're a big company, maybe you've got a group of 10 or 12 people who know the field, know the important papers. They can cut it down pretty quickly. They've got their own experience, et cetera, et cetera. But if I'm a 100-person company, maybe I've only got 2 people. And how do I compete? And I think this notion of building tooling to automatically ingest these volumes of information, if you will, and present it in such a way that you can operate on it, I think is a great leveling device in terms of how people will compete economically over the course of time. Historically, markets and economics have talked about the advantages of scale. And I think one of the great things about AI is it may, by crudely, representing the collective intelligence of what's going on in a particular domain, I'll let everybody to kind of play at a common level here without regard to size. That's a pretty exciting thing when you think about it. It means that small and developing countries have a chance to play in the big time, right? And it could be quite revolutionary in terms of how people conceive of competition going forward.
Yeah, so by having the area of cognitive discovery enable you to basically read all the new papers and have access to all the information. You democratize access to these new discoveries and information, and let the small startup compete with the big companies. And it's an
Yeah.
interesting time.
And the kinds of companies that we've partnered with on this so far are, with only a couple of exceptions, mid to small companies. And they've come with problems that are technical in nature, but at their heart, they're fundamentally competitive in nature. So we have one company that's concerned about fast followers in Asia. So they're doing innovative things, but they have fast followers that kind of erode the advantage of their innovation very quickly. Well, how do you deal with that? Well, maybe you put innovation on steroid and do things that much faster. And so one of the applications of this notion of cognitive discovery permits them to do that. They're punching above their weight quite dramatically as a result of having access to this kind of tooling. And all the problems that we looked at are typically, they would be viewed as HPC problems, right? Yeah. But we're using an AI approach with a great effort on this notion of how we get this collective body of know-how to be applied to the problem to solve it in a different kind of way. So it's just a different tool, different set of tool to solve what may be a problem that might be solvable by simulation, or it might go quite beyond what simulation can do. So every one of those cases will be a case-by-case decision of what the right tool is, but that's what life is about anyway, right? Not everything is a nail, not everything's a hammer. So it's the same thing here. We'll do simulation in some cases, intelligent simulation in others. We'll do cognitive discovery in a third. And when you look at the workflow, you'll see all these techniques being applied in one workflow, right? You'll see cognitive discovery maybe preparing the battleground by handling all the data and building some neural nets. And maybe that'll feed into some simulations. It'll be orchestrated by AI using Bayesian techniques. And the output will be analyzed with some AI techniques, comparing against the outputs of what we see in the literature. And voila, suddenly you've got something you could never do before.
Very good. Listen, Dave, this is all fascinating. Where we're heading, it's fantastic to hear. I wonder if IBM offers open access to AI in some form for people who wanted to play. Can you share something?
Let's see. We have a lot of ways, and I'm going to take you one step further in this domain of AI, and I'm just going to speak briefly about quantum, because we also have a big project going on in quantum at IBM, and for a couple of years I've been talking about quantum viewed as an accelerator to classical computing. Another way to put it would be, if we decompose workflows, there will be an opportunity in some workflows for the application of quantum approaches as well. So we see these things as all part of a bag of tools, if you will, that can come together in the right kind of context to produce really extraordinary and exceptional results. In the case of quantum, of course, we have, with the IBM Q, one can get on the web and play with our quantum system. In the case of cognitive discovery, if one looks up IBM React or IBM RxN, you can get access for free to a system we built with cognitive discovery tools at our Zurich laboratory that will allow you to assess, using cognitive approaches, assess the outcomes of chemical reactions. So you go in, you specify a number of molecules, a couple of reactants, and then you turn it over to the system and say, what do I get if these things react? By the way, we demonstrated that at the American Chemical Society meeting in the fall of last year in Boston, and measured it against professional chemists. Professional chemists, 25 years of experience, will get that answer right about 71, 72% of the time. Our system gets it right about 91% of the time. This is organic chemistry only. We're going to do backward reactions as well. You know, here's an output. What are the reagents and chemicals that went into it? So those are the kinds of things you can play with. base technology in quantum, application level in chemistry and AI, and then beyond that, of course, we have a whole product suite as well.
That sounds very good. Well, now that IBM has chosen Rescale for HPC in the cloud, I'm sure we'll be working together in a number of ways going forward.
That's right, and I think that's going to be quite complementary to all these ideas, because with Rescale and partnership in the marketplace, all the technologies we've talked about, by the way, are enabled to run in the cloud, both public and private, and so they'll be part of the portfolio going forward.
That's great, Dave. It's been really good listening to you, hearing your thoughts about where we're heading with rethinking HPC with AI. Before we close, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just enjoyed having the conversation with you, because typically, as you well know, people like us don't get that much time to speak about subjects that are important to us in any kind of detail. So this has been really important, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I think the last thing I'd like to leave listeners with is there's nothing we're talking about here should strike fear in the minds of anyone. I know that there's a lot of concern in the lay press about the impact on jobs and this and that with the emergence of AI. But I think it's going to give rise to new kinds of opportunities and new kinds of approaches in the field that we're talking about here that can provide some really great opportunities for people going forward. Study it, learn it, and participate in it, and I think everybody will be fine. It's not that hard going forward. The work that's gone on, not only by IBM, but other companies to automate or simplify the approaches, really goes a long way to the democratization of the technology to let normal people get access to it. And I think that's an important thing for everyone to keep in mind as we go forward.
Very good. Well, I would like to thank our guest, Dave Turek, Vice President for HPC and Cognitive Systems at IBM, for sharing his experience and his vision to help us understand the future with HPC and AI. Till next time, I am Gabriel Broner, and this was the Big Compute Podcast.